Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of the DMARC Bootcamp. Again, my name is Shahzad Mirza. I'm the Director of Operations for Global Cyber Alliance. So what we're going to be talking about this week is our focus will be on DMARC itself. So what a DMARC policy is, what are the different parts to the DMARC policy, and when you're creating and developing this DMARC policy. So are the different tags and values that are associated with it. We're also later in this later half of this session is we're going to show you how to implement and create the SPF and DKIM and DMARC records using bind DNS. So if you did join our session yesterday, the first half will be repetitive. It's going to be the same thing. It's the latter half that's going to be different on how you actually do it and how you implement it using bind or Linux DNS. So if you remember from the first week, we talked about what DMARC specifically is. But the thing that's important in this case right now is the two parts of DMARC, right? There's the DMARC policy and there's DMARC verification. The DMARC policy is what you actually have to create as the domain owner, right? Or as the sending domain. You're responsible for that domain. You're responsible for making sure it's protected, and that's why you would implement DMARC in order to protect your brand and protect any messages that are using your domain name. Any legitimate messages that are using your domain name, right? And that's so you're creating that and you're implementing that on DNS. The other half is the DMARC verification. So that's where the receiving side is going to enable or turn on DMARC verification in order to check all incoming messages to see if those messages have a domain policy associated with it, right? So we're not going to focus on the DMARC verification side because each of the vendors have a different way of going about turning it on. So there's going to be in different menu options, different location, and there may be other various options that might be available to you depending on the vendor that you're using. So if you're using things like iron ports, Cisco iron ports, or Mimecast systems, or Proofpoint, or the Semantic McAfee email gateways, go and look at their guides to see what you need to do in terms of enabling and turning on DMARC verification and what the options are there. So we're going to leave that alone. Our focus in this session is going to be strictly on the DMARC policy and the various aspects of the DMARC policy. So things you need to consider having early, if you're able to take the time to get this information. Right, mail system servers that are used for the organization. So that's going to really help more with SPF and DKIM because those are the kinds of things that are going to define, this is what we need to have in our SPF. Can we set up a DKIM signature on these different mail servers? Plus, it also can help you determine, okay, what domains do you actually have to implement DMARC on? Right, because those are the ones you're going to focus specifically on different things and different configurations and different settings for DMARC. Right, but then you should also have a list of public domains that you're not using for email, right? And those you still got to use you still got to protect those with DMARC, but there's gonna there might be a quicker way, and there's gonna be a quicker way of protecting those. So have your list of domains, all public-facing domains, and know which ones have mail associated with them and which ones do not. The ones that do not have mail associated with them, I'll show you today in the demonstration what's a quick way to just really protect those using DMARC. All right, and then we'll also obviously talk about the ones that if you do have email associated with them or you use your email for those domains, what you need to do. But you also need to have admin level access to your DNS, right? So whether it be you or somebody else within your organization, be familiar with that. Know who is responsible for the DNS in your organization, who has access to that public DNS, so the public facing DNS, because that's where all the records are going to be created. Right, so it's going to be that system that has your www, so your website's address, your mail records, your mail server records are going to be on there because they're all public facing information. Right, so DMARC, SPF, and DKIM are all public records that you're creating. Now, the type of record you're creating for DMARC is going to be a TXT record. So it's a resource record, TXT resource record. And when you create these records, what you do in DNS, it'll ask for a name and then it'll ask for a value that you want to associate with that record. Right, so when it comes to DMARC, it's important to have the name in place because that name must be, and this is required, underscore DMARC. And that's exactly it, just underscore DMARC. So the underscore must be present, DMARC lowercase, in order for this to function, because that's what these DMARC verification tools are going to look for. They're going to look for that underscore DMARC name in your DNS. Once it finds that name, it's going to look at the value that you have associated with that name, or the text that you have associated with that. And then it's the value or the text that's going to define your authentication, your reporting, and your conformance for DMARC. This is where you're going to put all of that information. Right, so what we're going to do over the next few slides, we're going to talk about each of those values. What's the V mean? What the P equals mean? What does the RUA equal, and so on. So the first tag is V equals DMARC1. That's the first tag that must appear in the value. So the V equals can't be at the end, it's not in the middle, it's at the right in front. First thing you're going to put in, V equals DMARC1. So this is defining the version of DMARC that's being utilized. And there is no other version right now. And I haven't read anything about another version being considered or being released anytime soon. So you're going to put in V equals DMARC1. Now, not all of these tags are going to be required. So the V equals is required, right? The P tag is required. We're here listing that the RUA tag is required, but technically it's not. All right, it is an optional tag, but I'll explain later as to why we're saying that it's required. Right, then recommended is the RUF tag. Something you want to consider using is the SP tag, and you have a good amount of optional tags. And I am going to go through each one of these individually. All right, so the first tag is V equals DMARC1. And now as we go through the slides as well, what you're going to notice is that each tag is separated by a semicolon. So that semicolon is also required because that's the proper syntax for the DMARC policy. So the next tag after the next tag after V equals DMARC1 is going to be the P tag. So you see V equals DMARC1, semicolon, P equals, and the conformance level you're going to use. So your policy level. So P equals none, P equals quarantine, or P equals reject. Right? I'm saying or because you can't have two DMARC policies for one domain. Each domain has only one DMARC policy applied to it. All right, so each unique domain has one DMARC policy applied to it. The other thing to take into account with the P tag is that what does the P tag actually apply to? It does apply to the top level domain, so the domain that you're creating the policy for. But the P tag can also apply to the sub-level domains as well. Right, so you're protecting your sub-level domains by having that P tag in there. But it could also create some scenarios where there's issues, especially if those subdomains are being used for mail and you're ready to move your top level domain up to a quarantine or reject level, to an enforcement level. But we'll talk about that a little bit later as to what you can do to resolve that. Right, so but V tag first, then the P tag is second. And what do each of these policy levels mean? None. Right, none is for monitored only mode, or like I like to call monitored only mode, because what you're basically doing at this session is saying, hey, there's a DMARC policy here, but we're not enforcing it right now. We don't want you to enforce it. We need to get more information to make sure that our configuration is set up correctly for our SPF, for our DKIM, for our alignment, and so on, to make sure everything is set up correctly for all of our legitimate systems. So this is the time you take to put that in and be able to get reports. But the key thing to note is that by putting in just P equals none does not enable reporting. It does not turn on reporting. There are additional tags you need in order to turn on reporting. Okay, so if you just go with V equals DMARC1 semicolon P equals none, yes, you would technically have a DMARC policy, but it's not doing anything whatsoever. It's just sitting there, and it's basically as if you didn't even have a policy in place. You just put text there, right? So by putting the policy level, the P tag in there does not enable reporting. You have to take additional steps to enable reporting. But before we get to that, so your next two policy levels are quarantine and reject. So this is where, again, you make sure from the reports, you get those reports, review the reports, make sure that SPF and DKIM and your DMARC, DKIM and SPF alignment are all passing, or as passing as best as possible, right? Because if all of those checks were to fail and you're in quarantine, then the message is sent to spam junk folder. At reject, the message is completely dropped. So you need to make sure that at least SPF and SPF alignment and or DKIM and DKIM alignment are passing. So if DKIM is passing completely, so in terms of the alignment is passing, DKIM checks are passing, you're fine, right? It's not going to fail the message. It has to be both SPF and DKIM, and the alignment has to be off as well in order for this to fail. So the best practice is to start off at none and gradually move to reject. But again, reviewing those reports. The reports are very important, and that's where you have to make sure you have one of these two tags or both of these tags in order to enable reporting. Right, so I mentioned that RUA and RUF, they're technically optional tags, right? You don't have to put them in there. But again, if you're at P equals none and you don't put anything else in there, you're not doing anything to benefit yourself or your organization because you don't know now. There's no way for you to determine whether you're ready to go to quarantine or reject. It's the reports that are going to assist you with that and doing the analysis of the reports, right? Because again, those reports will give you that information, especially the RUA or the aggregate reports are the critical ones you want to get. That's the report that's going to have the IP address of the servers sending using your domain, whether it's legitimate or fraudulent servers. Right, it'll tell you whether SPF and DKIM are passing, whether SPF, DKIM alignment are aligning. I'll tell you about DMARC as well. So your reports will have that aggregate report is going to have all that information. That's why, from our standpoint, we're saying that the RUA tag should be required. So you put in the RUA tag so you can get those reports, do the analysis, and then that way you have information, enough information to hopefully get you up to quarantine or reject. So by putting in the RUA tag, you put in RUA equals mail to : and then the email address that you want to send that you want the receiving side to send the reports to. All right, and then there's RUF, and those are forensic or failure reports. These you may not get, right? There's a possibility that you may not get any at all, depending on the receiving side. Majority of the receiving sides do not send these because there's some issues with privacy. It's really because these are technically, they're not reports. They're actually the full message itself. So you may actually be thinking that they're, when you're looking at the message that maybe you were BCC'd in that message, but you weren't. It was just, this was a message that failed because, and you got the copy of it because it failed or triggered a failure on something. DKIM was wrong or SPF was wrong or some setting was wrong. So you got that information. And the goal is to really to be able to look at the email headers to determine what was the issue and how you can make sure that those messages actually get delivered. But in most cases, if you do get these, they tend to be more of spam messages. So people are actually trying to spoof you. So I've seen more of those than anything else. So if you put the RUF tag in there, you put in RUF equals mail to : and then the email address. Right, it's important to have that mail to : before the email address because that's going to define where to send these reports to. Okay, and the other key thing is I neglected to mention was that after the P tag, the order doesn't matter. So you can go V equals DMARC 1 : P equals none : RUF equals, and then RUA equals. That's fine. It'll still work. But the V and the P tag have to be first. Everything else after that is you can pretty much go in any order that you want. So now, if you want to have more than one email address, can you do that? Yeah, you can do that. You can have multiple email addresses. It's really recommended to only limit yourself to 3 or 4 email addresses. Anything beyond that, it's a good chance that the reports may actually not get delivered to those other remaining email addresses that you put in there. So that's why it's a good idea to just use a generic account within your organization. Right? So like DMARC-RUA at company.com, DMARC-RUF at company.com if you want to separate those two out. Because the way it also works by default is that you can only send the reports to an email address for that domain that you're creating the policy for. So if you're creating a DMARC policy for company.com, the reports by default can only be sent to somebody within company.com. You can send mail and send these reports to external users as well. So somebody outside of your domain, that can be done. right? But there's just additional steps that need to be taken in order for that external organization or user to be able to receive those messages and receive those emails, right? They have to do it this way. You can't just put in anyone's email address and start spamming them and inundating them with all of your DMARC reports, right? So a little protection mechanism that's in place there. So whomever you be working with, if you're working with a third-party vendor to review reports, they'll tell you to, this is it, this is where you're going to send the reports to, and then on their end, they're going to do a couple of changes and adjustments to be able to accept those reports. All right, so default, it's set up to only be able to send internally, but you can send it to external. There just has to be a little bit more work along with whomever you're sending it to get that accomplished. Also, when you're separating out the multiple email addresses, you don't use the RUA tag multiple times or the RUF tag multiple times. You only use the tag once, right? Like in SPF, you were able to use include multiple times or the A tag multiple times. That's not how it works with DMARC. You can only use the tag once. So how do you put in the email address? You put in RUA equals mail to : the first email, comma, mail to : the second email, comma, mail to : the third email, semicolon, and then same thing with RUF if you want to send to multiple addresses. So you separate each of the emails using a comma, but you use the mail to : before each email address. And then don't forget about that semicolon to end the tag. Now the remaining tags here are going to be completely optional. So this is really up to you whether you want to use them or not, but each of these tags also have a default setting. So if you do not define it in your policy, it is going to use the default option for that tag, okay? So the first tag is the FO tag. This is optional and it's only used if you're using RUF. So if you're doing the forensic and failure reports, and what it's basically saying is what to trigger these messages, these sample emails. What's the failure aspect of it that triggers it and to send those messages, right? So by default, it's FO equals 0. So if you do not put in the FO tag in your policy, it is going to revert to 0. Okay, and 0 is generate report if all underlying authentication mechanisms fail to produce an aligned pass result. Your other options are 1, D, and S, right? So FO equals 1, generate report if the underlying authentication mechanism produces something other than an aligned pass result. For D, if it's for DKIM specific failures, or S is for SPF specific failures, right? And the most common ones that I see are either 1 or 0 or 1. ADKIM and ASPF, these are also optional. Okay, they don't work together. You can use one or the other. So you can just put an ADKIM, or you can put an ASPF. You don't have to use both. But if you do, just remember, you're still using that semicolon to separate things out. So your options for ADKIM and ASPF are R for relaxed, which is the default, and S for strict. What's the difference between the two? And most common one is relaxed, which is the default setting. And this is really used to define it in terms of how the alignment is and how the domains are viewed for alignment. So the domain, so say in DKIM, the domain is set to Global Cyber Alliance, but the from address is m.globalcyberalliance.org, right? Technically, they're not the same domain, right? I mean, yes, the top level domain is the same, but they're technically not also the same domain, right? They don't match 100%. So if you're in relaxed, something like that is going to still be allowed because at least it's the same domain in essence. So the top level domain is still the same. So you're allowed to see, it's going to allow, it's going to say, okay, you know what, we'll let it go. We'll accept that. But strict is going to be no, it has to be exactly the domain. So everything has to match exactly. So if it's a subdomain from your from and the top level domain in SPF or DKIM, that's not a match. So be careful with this. How do you know whether to use relaxed or strict? Well, most people just by default just stick with relaxed and they don't bother even going with strict in any ways, right? But doesn't mean that you can't use strict. So what you have to do is look at your reports, review your reports. If on your reports, you're going to see DKIM is always aligned, it's always using your actual domain, it's always matches, then you're good. You can actually consider using strict. And that's the only time I typically see it for ADKIM, when people use strict, because that tends to always match up. The domain alignment, everything, and the from address, everything always seems to match up. SPF, not so much, especially with third-party vendors, because the third-party vendors don't always, they still seem to use their own server names rather than using, your own domain name. RF and RI, these are also optional. So RF is report format, RI is reporting interval. So report format is going to define, so basically these emails will come in, they'll have attachment, the reports will be attached as an attachment to it in an XML format. But the format can either be AFRF, which is abuse report format, or IODEF, incident of object description exchange format. By default, that is AFRF. I personally haven't seen anyone use IODEF. Doesn't mean it hasn't been used. I'm sure somebody out there has been using it, but really this is just, the report format is going to really matter in terms of what you're using to ingest these reports. Right, majority of people and vendors that will stick with the default reporting format, but if there's some sort of device or a SIM or something like that that can ingest these kinds of reports, they may ask for an IODF version of it or formatting of it so they can do it the right way. So that's really depending on what you're using and what how you're reviewing and ingesting these reports. But I provide the RFC so that way if you really want to look at the nitty gritty and then look at the differences between the two, you can do so. RI is a reporting interval, so that is reported in seconds. So the default is 84,600 seconds or 24 hours. So be careful of that. So don't put in like RI equals 10 or RI equals 24, because that'll be 10 seconds or 24 seconds. And this is really defining that how often reports should be sent or what time frame these reports should be reporting on. So if you do 24 hours, but using the default, so within a 24-hour period, you should get reports from different receiving systems to say, hey, here's a report. This is what we've seen over this 24-hour period, and letting you know what this is. These are this is what's going on with SPF DKIM, and these are the IP addresses we're seeing that are sending using your domain name. Right. So you're not going to get a bunch of reports at like 9 a.m. every single day or 10 a.m. every single day. You may get them scattered out, but it's always going to have that 24-hour period unless you change the value, right? If you lower or increase the value, then that's going to adjust the aggregate reports as well. So in most cases, I see people reduce it. And the reason I see people reduce it is because when they get to the first set of reports, they see a lot of spam activity. Like they say, oh, we have no idea what these are. These are completely outside of our control. These aren't even valid third-party senders that they know of. So they'll reduce the time frame so that way they can, as they're making adjustments to SPF and DKIM, they can get information quicker back. They can get those reports back quickly. They can review them, make sure everything is set up correctly, and then move up to the quarantine or reject levels. All right. So remember, these are in seconds when you do this. And the default is, so if you do not define the RI, the default is going to be 84,600. Then there's a percentage tag, PCT tag, which is also optional. And what the purpose of the percentage tag is to define what percentages of messages for your domain are impacted by DMARC, are impacted by this DMARC policy. So your options are anywhere from 0 to 100. The default is 100 if you don't define it. Or you can put in PCT equals 100, if you want to explicitly define it. So how do you know which messages, or how do you define which messages are the ones that are being impacted? You can't, you don't. So if you put in PCT equals 50, that means 50% of the messages are going to be impacted by DMARC, the DMARC policy. The other 50% are not going to be impacted by DMARC, but you don't know which ones. So typically the way it should work is the ones that, if they're, as long as they're coming from your environment and from something, your SPF and everything is set up correctly, they should get, they should be impacted by the policy. But again, you don't have control over that. So it's up to you if you want to use it. I mean, I say, like, if you're putting in P equals none is monitored only mode anyways, so leave it at 100. If you're going to quarantine or reject, you're basically ready to go. You're not going to move it to those unless you're actually ready to move to those. So leave the percentage equal to 100. But take into account, though, if you do adjust the numbers, if you put in P equals quarantine and percentage is equal to 0, that's the same exact thing as putting in P equals none. If you put in p equals reject with a PCT equal to 0, that's the same as p equals quarantine. So if you're at quarantine or reject, use a number higher than 0 or a value higher than 0. And then the last tag we're going to talk about is the SP tag. This is also optional, but it's something you may want to consider using, right? And the reason for that is what the SP tag is going to define is the sub-level domain policy, right? Because for the P tag, we said that applies to the top level domain, but also applies to all the sub-level domains as well, which can create some issues depending on your situation or depending on your environment, but it could also be beneficial, right? But now if you do not put in the SP tag, it automatically defaults to whatever the P tag setting is, right? So if your P tag is equal to reject, that means reject is applied to your top level as well as your subdomains, right? So what are some scenarios in which you should consider using this? If you're still going through your top level domain and reviewing it and making sure everything is set up correctly and you're still at P equals none, but you also know that you don't have any subdomains in your environment. We don't use subdomains for anything. So then what you do, put in SP equals reject. So that prevents attackers and spammers from using your domain as a subdomain in emails and in spoofing. So that's where it's a benefit to put in SP equals reject at that point. All right, and the report should also give you information about those subdomains as well. The other flip side of that is that if you do have multiple subdomains and those subdomains are actually used for email, right? Because if you move to P equals reject or P equals quarantine at the top level, what's the problem that you run into? Your sub-level domains are also going to be at reject and quarantine. If then those are used to send mail and they're not set up correctly, all their messages are going to be rejected or quarantined, right? So what you want to do is you want to add in the SP tag equals none, and then each of those subdomains needs to go through, review their information, set up their own SPF, their own DKIM records, and their own DMARC policy, right? So that way, when they set up their DMARC policy, they're reviewing everything, they're going through everything, they set up their DMARC policy up to P equals reject, and that will override the SP equals none at the top level domain. Right, and then it should hopefully resolve some other conflicts like the SPF, some SPF issues, right? Because if only that subdomain is using those third-party mail servers, you don't need them at the top level domain. You just leave them for the sub-level domain to use. All right, so those are all the different tags that are available to you and the values that are, for the value for those tags and, what options you have for each of those tags. So again, do you need them all? No. The ones you need at least to have in place are the V equals, P equals, and the RUA equals, right? Those are the three critical tags. So that's the information that's going to give everything that you need and define the things that you need, right? The SP tag is something you take into consideration, and the other ones, maybe you might want to adjust them accordingly, but that's something you can always do over time. So you can get started by just putting in the host name of _DMARC, put in the value of V equals DMARC1, semicolon, P equals none, semicolon, RUA equals mail2, email address you want to send it to send the reports to, semicolon, RUF equals mail2, and the email address you're going to send those reports to, semicolon. All right, so those are all the different tags and all the different configurations that you have. So I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to keep going. Again, if there are any questions, feel free to post those questions in the questions box and I'll do my best to answer those. But since I don't see any questions right now, what we're going to do is we're going to switch over and I'm going to show you how to implement these SPF, DKIM, and DMARC using Office 365 and using a bind server. So we're going to go through different options. So here I am right now, I'm connected to the bind server. Here in this window here in the background, I have the Office 365 Admin Center set up because I'm just going to use this to gather some information and collect some information. So hopefully here I'm still connected. All right, good, I'm still connected. So when you're on a system with bind, what you need to make sure you do is obviously you need to go to where the zone files exist. And on a bind server, And I'm just doing, so there is a GUI mechanism and GUI method of going and connecting to a bind server. It makes it nice and easy to see. There is, but that's easy. So I want to show people in case that you have to go, when you go, some people work just strictly with command line. So that's why we're going to focus on that and putting in and using command line, the command line version. So we have to make sure, obviously, we're in the right directory, which is, so in this case, it's Etsy bind. And then under Etsy bind, this is where we have two databases. So an empty one, we have one for .dmarc.org. So the zone file that we're working with is going to be db.dmarc.org. So I'm going to sudo, and yes, I'm going to use nano, db.dmarc.org. And this is our zone file. Right, so this is where we have MX records, we have, so we have MX records, we have our www, FTP, and mail records in here. Now, when you're working with bind and the files within bind, the zone files within bind, there's some things to take into account. One thing to take into account is that if you have something, a line like this, so it's origin.dmarc.org. If that line is there, that means that anything that's before that, you have to actually put out the fully qualified domain name and define the fully qualified domain name, right? Unless it's null, but the null option should take on the .dmarc.org. But if it's not, like if I were to put www up top here, I'll put www.dmarc.org in and then the IP address. But since it's below here, this is where I can just put in www, I can just put in FTP, I can just put in mail. So just watch out for that, because a lot of people will see this here, and what people will do is they'll put in www.dmarc.org. But the problem is that when you actually look up this file or review this DNS, what you ended up doing was you made it now www.dmarc.org.dmarc.org. So so this automatically got appended again. So be wary of that when you're doing and you're working with bind. So if you have this, make sure you just give it the name and not the fully qualified domain name. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add in our SPF record. So I'm just going to do that up here. So I'm going to define SPF record, and just for convention's sake. So one thing to take note of, I'm using semicolons here. When you're using semicolon in a bind file, that means it's a comment. You're commenting it out. So it's just meant for description purposes. You're just letting people know that this is what this is. This is where the MX records are. These are where the SPF records are. This is where these kinds of records are, and so on. Right. So they're not actually things that are getting processed. And that's very important to note that with a semicolon. And what we're going to do here is we're going to be using null and it's a TXT file that we're creating. And then this is where we're going to put in where our V equals SPF1, right? We know we're using mail exchanger records because we have two right here. And then we'll just put in a dash all. So that's our SPF, right? So the next thing would be to save the file, quit out of the file, restart the bind service, and now you have appropriate SPF record in place, right? Because that's important. Don't just save the file. You do need to restart the service as well in order for it to go into effect. But now the thing is I'm using Office 365. So the thing is, whenever you use a third-party vendor, always check to see what their requirements are, because they're going to most likely tell you that you need to actually include a statement into your SPF, right? So we're going to check Office 365. And how do you check this? In Office 365, what you can do is go to settings, go to domains, and under domains, you'll see your domains listed. I use dmarc.org. I'm going to go to DNS Records, and here it's going to tell me these are the DNS records you need to have in place. Right now, the status that says okay is because we're actually using a cloud service provider, and all those records are actually there. The Linux server is not an actual legitimate service to be there. So we already have an MX record in place, but look at their SPF that they define. They put in V equals SPF1, include spf.protection.outlook.com. They're saying this needs to be present, right? So what do? Do I have to go in and click on it and say, okay, we need to do this? right? No, that's not right. That's actually incorrect. And the reason it's incorrect is because you can only have one SPF record for that domain. So what we actually have to do is inside of the one that's already present, we have to add in include spf.protection.outlook.com, right? So that's what we have to actually do. So instead of MX, we don't necessarily have to use the MX. We could actually put in IP4, and IP4 we can point to the IP address of the mail server, right? So that's one less lookup, because if you put in MX, it's going to look up mail.gotdmarc.org to get to the IP address. It's going to do a lookup for .dmarc-org to get the information as well. All right, and then that's all you would do. So if you're adding more, so if you have, you know, say Salesforce, and I'm pretty sure this is not the right one for Salesforce, but you know, you just put in, you know, you would add Salesforce and so on and so forth. But again, look at the third-party vendor and see what they tell you to add to your SPF and put that into your SPF. Just make sure everything is between the V equals SPF1 and the dash all. Okay, everything goes in between that in whatever order. All right, so that's how you create the SPF record. So there's a question about, does anything change if you have a domain forwarded to another domain website? So yeah, things will change. So like for SPF, if you have redirect, so in SPF, you can actually put in V equals SPF1 redirect in the domain you want to redirect your SPF2. So that's an option, but as long as they have an SPF record for you, then that's the one that you can use. Some other options is what we're going to show you. I'm going to show you next is with DKIM, right? So when I'm creating DKIM keys, I'm going to actually create that down here. So I'll put in DKIM records. So when it comes to third-party vendors, you're most likely going to be using C names that you're going to be creating. Some third-party vendors will actually have you create text records, and I'm going to show you both, right? You know, with Office 365 and a majority of other ones, they actually have you create a C name record, and you can get some information about what kind of record you need to create right actually from their portal. And the way you can do that is here by going in the admin center, you actually go to security. But just to be clear, if you're still using the old view, because Office 365 just recently updated their portal and they move things around. So if you're using the old version or the old view, you have to go under Exchange, and under Exchange it's protection, and under protection is DKIM. But now they moved it by using the new portal and the new view. You have to actually go to security, and then under security you're going to go to threat management. Then under threat management, you're going to click on policy, and under policy, you see here is DKIM, right? And then this is where you're going to find and get information about DKIM. And there's always by default, when you're using Office 365, all your messages are actually being signed using this on Microsoft.com version. The problem here is that if you use that, DKIM is going to pass, but DMARC is going to say that the signatures are failed unaligned. And the reason why is because the email uses .dmarc.org, so the from address is .dmarc.org, but the domain in DKIM is saying gca1.onmicrosoft.com, two completely different domains. So this is where you would go into like Office 365 or Google G Suites or MailChimp or HubSpot and find out what you need to have and what are the CNAME records or text records that you need to create. Now, one thing just to show you this is this isn't going to work. So with .dmarc, it's going to tell us here, you see there's no DKIM keys saved for this domain. If you ever run into that, what you actually have to do is you have to actually go into PowerShell. And in PowerShell, you actually have to connect to Exchange Online. And from the command shelf, you have to go and basically type out commands in terms of to set up the DKIM keys and enable the DKIM keys, right? And I'm not going to go through that process just for time's sake. But if you go to our website, dmarc.globalcyberalliance.org, under implementation guides, there's a section for Office 365, and it tells you step by step on how to connect to the PowerShell. how to use PowerShell to connect to Exchange Online, and then how to do all the DKIM settings and configuration. And really, once you do that, what you should be able to see is like we see in a Global Cyber Alliance, is something like this. Difference will be it'll most likely say enable. But if it doesn't say enable, I mean, it should actually say disable, and this is where you can go in and turn it on. The problem is again, I can't just enable it, and the reason why is because the records do not exist. What third-party vendors are going to have you do is they're going to make sure that you create the public record for the DKIM key, right? That has to be present, because if it's not present and they start signing your messages, technically all your messages are going to fail DKIM because there's nothing for it to compare against. There's nothing for it to check against, right? And the nice thing is in Office 365 is they actually tell you that you have to publish CNAME records, right? You have to publish 2 CNAME records, and these are the record names that you have to create, right? Just so people know, if you're familiar with Office 365 and DKIM, they changed this as well. So originally they actually gave you the values of the record and not the names of the record. Now they're giving you the names of the record, but not the values of the record. So take that into account when you're working with this. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to create CNAME records for this. So we're going to go back into our bind, right? I'm going to put in the selector. So this is the name, selector1._domain key, right? Tab in CNAME, and then the value. Now the value, that the way it works is with Office 365, it's always going to start off with selector 1 or selector 2, right? Then selector 1 dash, then where the record is going to apply to. So you have to put in what they call the GUID, or the ID for the global unique ID. And the global unique ID you can take from what they give you in the MX record, so the first part of it, right? So check that, got DMARC-org in this situation, right? But just make sure that you look at that when you're doing this. So got DMARC-org ._domain key dot, and then what the rest of this is going to be is actually going to be the value of your default signing domain. So technically it's still using this, it's going to be using this as your public key and private key. So GCA1.onmicrosoft.com. So GCA1.onmicrosoft.com. Oops. Right, and obviously spelled correctly. So I can just take this, so copy it back again and just change, because there's 2 selectors, right? So selector 1 and selector 2. So I just change the values to this. Oops. Selector 1, selector 2, right? Save the file, restart the service, and there you go. All right, so that's how you do if you're doing that with the CNAME and third parties. Now there's going to be situations where you may have to, they may, have to generate the keys yourself. So say, in this case, we have mail.dmarc.org. So we have a sendmail server, for example, on here, right? And so sendmail has something that does have the ability to create DKIM keys. Let me save this. And then it has the ability to create DKIM keys. And what it does to use and create those DKIM keys is something called OpenDKIM. So there's a tool called OpenDKIM. It's something that's actually built into it. You can actually download it separately as well, right? So because we don't actually have sendmail on this system, but we did install OpenDKIM. So I can show you how it actually works. All right. So the way OpenDKIM works is that we're going to use sudo, right? Sudo, because we want admins, we want admin level access to this, and admin to do this and have admin only level access. We don't want just anyone accessing it. Open DKIM -gen key. So that's the command to generate the keys. We're going to use -b to define the size. So we'll use 2048. -d to define the domain that's associated, that we're creating the record for. Right, got.dmarc.org. The directory we want, oops, -d, it's capital D. The directory we want the keys to be stored. So /etc. It's going to go into OpenDKIM keys/.dmarc.org. That's where we're going to put them. Define our selector. So remember, if you remember from last week, the DKIM keys, and when you're creating a text record, you have to do, you typically will have the option to select what the or define what the name of the record is going to be, right? So like Microsoft says, the name of the records have to be selector 1 and selector 2. So that's what they put and define as the selectors. And most third parties will actually tell you that these are going to be the selector names. You don't have a choice in that. But in this scenario, we do have a choice. We can define what we want. We can put in our date. We can put in the name of the server. Just make sure you use something that you know that this DKIM key is associated with this server or this mail system. Okay, so I'll just use default. So -s default, and then I'm going to put -v is for verbose mode. So this way it'll tell me what's going on. So now here it generated the private key. The private key was written to default.private. It extracted the public key from the default, and it wrote the DNS TXT record that you need to default.txt. Okay, so now you do need to change a few permissions, and we're going to do that really quick here, just so I can get access to it. So open DKIM DKIM. Oops. Open DKIM. I'm just making sure that we're putting /etc open DKIM /keys/ DMARC.org /default.private. Right, so I want to make sure that you have access to that, and then I want to take a look at the default.txt. So I'm going to cat etc /open DKIM /keys /dmarc.org /default.txt. Right, and what this is giving me here is the information that I need to put in to my DNS. Right, so I can copy the whole thing, go back into my DNS, go down to the section for DKIM records, and paste in my information. All right, so make sure you copy the whole thing, because if you're missing any parts of this, it's going to create a problem. So make sure you have the whole entire thing copied and the entire thing put in. We also notice that they put quotation marks. So these quotation marks here are going to be very critical, because you see there's semicolons. And what does it mean if you have a semicolon? Right, the semicolon means it's a comment. So if you're missing those quotation marks, all they're going to see is v equals DKIM1, and then everything after the semicolon is going to be commented out. They're not going to see the rest of that. All right, so be careful when you're setting this up, and be careful when you're creating these putting this in. Make sure you have quotation marks, especially if you're using semicolons. Right, so this is where you're creating a CNAME, right? CNAME is pointing it to a different domain, and then the TXT record in case that's the situation. So like if you're using Google G Suite, you're going to be most likely creating a TXT record, right? Or if you're using like a on-prem Exchange or SendMail or Postfix, you're most likely going to be using Open DKIM and creating your own tags and keys. All right, so that's SPF, that's DKIM, and now let me show you how to create a DMARC record. So here we'll just put a semicolon and define that this is our DMARC record. Right, so when we're creating DMARC records, now I'm not going to the Office 365 portal. I'm not going into any special tool to define how to create the DMARC policy. I mean, there are online wizards where you can input information, and what they'll do is the output is to give you, this is what your record needs to be. Right, so like we have one, Global Cyber Alliance has a DMARC setup guide, and you can put in all the information, and it'll spit out for you what the actual record is going to be. But in this case here, I'm just going to type it out. So remember the name, always _DMARC. Right, I'm not adding .DMARC. Why? Because I'm putting this after the $origin. All right, if I did it above it, then I'm going to need to add it. So _DMARC in, and remember what type of record we're creating. It's a TXT record, right? And then this is where I'm going to use quotations. Why we're using quotation? Because remember how the tags work in DMARC. V equals DMARC1 semicolon, right? If I don't put that quotation mark in there, everything after this semicolon is going to be commented out. And that's a problem because then all they're going to see is V equals DMARC1 and that's it. So make sure you put the quotation marks in there. So V equals DMARC1, I'm going to say P equals none, semicolon, and we're going to send reports to RUA at .dmarc.org. Semicolon, and we'll do the same thing with RUF. RUF equals mail2 colon DMARC-RUF at .dmarc.org. Now, just so people know, these emails actually don't exist, so don't go putting these into your into your DMARC policies. Right, so V equals DMARC1, P equals, and that's it. Save the file, do what I need to do, and there you go. This is now you have put this into bind. Right. So that's all that's necessary, and that's only that needs to get done. Right, but then now if you need to make modifications to it, you come back and make modifications to it as needed. Right, I'm looking at the reports, and the reports I see that the subdomains. We don't have subdomains, but I'm seeing subdomains. So I put in SPF equals reject. Spelled correctly. Right. You know, I see that based on my reports, I can actually put in DKIM equals S. I can make it strict if I choose to. Right, so these are things you just go in and make those adjustments to this as you choose. Right, and now I've decided that, you know, based on my reports, and I reviewed all my reports, SPF looks to be right, DKIM looks to be right. I'm going to go ahead and jump to reject. Spelled correctly. Right, and now we're at the policy reject. So this is where you're going to make all those changes. So majority of the things that you're going to actually see when you're at P equals none, a lot of things you're going to be doing is going to be adding DKIM records. You're going to be modifying your SPF. That's where the majority of the changes are going to be being made when you're reviewing these reports. The only things you're going to probably do to your DMARC policy is either to move it from none to quarantine or reject, or maybe apply that SP tag to it at the end, or, you know, however order. Right, those are just things that you're going to be, that they're most likely going to do. So the DKIM is not going to change, or sorry, DMARC is not going to change as much as you are going to change SPF in the DKIM records and add DKIM records. All right. Now, I also told you what, you know, that I was going to tell you what to do if we're not using the domain for email. So what do we do in those situations? So, oops. I think I deleted everything. Yes, I did. It's fine. No. All right. Let's go back in. So this is the things that we're going to do, right? So say I don't have this, I don't have mail servers in place, right? So we'll get rid of this one too. So obviously I don't need DKIM records, right? And I didn't save it with the DMARC stuff. So what I'm going to do is for my SPF record, I'm going to modify this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the MX, the include, and the include statements. So that's one thing that you need to have. So all you're going to have is V equals SPF1 dash all. And the reason you're going to have this one is in case people are doing just SPF verification, you're basically telling them like, look, this domain, it doesn't allow anything to be used to send a mail on our behalf. So that you're doing that as a safeguard. And then what you're doing also then is you're going to add in underscore DMARC in TXT, and you're going to say that V equals DMARC1 semicolon P equals reject. And technically you could just stop there and save it like that. I mean, I would still recommend putting in the RUA tag, right? And only because, you know, wouldn't you be curious to see if anyone uses this domain for for spoofing? You know, maybe it would, because if you end up getting an email or a report that's saying, hey, here's a DMARC report for this domain, what does that mean? That means somebody actually used your domain to spoof it and you actually protected it. And I've seen that. I have my own personal domains that I don't use at all for email, and I've been getting reports. that they're being used and people have actually used them and spoofed them. So, but that's all you need to do. I mean, there are other things that you may see out there. They say just put in a DKIM record, just put in a completely blank DKIM record. But I mean, if there's no DKIM signature that's in the messages anyways, by default, there's nothing to check against. Even if there is a DKIM signature there, when they come to look it up and look up your domain, they shouldn't find anything. So it should always end up unaligning anyways. So, but there are recommendations out there. Some people say to put in DKIM, and you can. It won't hurt anything if you do. All right. So those are the different options in the different situation where you can go in and you're going to be and you're working with DMARC, SPF, DKIM, and so DMARC, SPF, and DKIM. So there's one question here: does DKIM key have an expiry date when you create it? It does not. It does not actually. When you create it, it has no expiration date. It's up to you to go through and rotate it. My recommendation is in terms of rotation, maybe once or twice a year. If you have a PKI policy, typically in the PKI policy, they'll find rotation of your various certificates. Just add DKIM to that and do DKIM alongside with that. Otherwise, if you want to go based on the RFC, I think the RFC says to do it every 30, 60, or 90 days, which I think is too much. I would say probably either once or twice a year. It would be my recommendation. But just make sure you also do it like on a weekend or off hours, because just to allow for DNS to propagate correctly and appropriately. So next steps here, and that's the next actions for you to take. Go ahead. So if you do not have DMARC policy applied to your domain, go ahead and apply it, right? Apply it at the policy level none, right? I've given you what the record should look like, right? Underscore DMARC, V equals DMARC1, P equals none, RUI equals mail2, RUF equals mail2, right? With the appropriate semicolons. So if you go ahead and do it, and if you actually do it before the end of the bootcamp and you attend all the sessions, so if you attend all the sessions to this full capacity and then you implement DMARC, we'll actually give you extra credit. We'll actually give you an extra 3 credits attached to your certificate. But if you have any questions while you're doing so, feel free to email us. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions before you do the implementation, and we'll be happy to answer those questions. So just as a reminder, there is one more session this week. You do not need to attend that session, since if you've attended this session. It's the only reason to attend it is if you're interested in cloud DNS, because again, the first half is going to be the same exact stuff we just talked about today. It's the last half we'll be using Google Cloud DNS and using Ionis 1-in-1, just to give you 2 examples of how to set up DMARC and SPF and DKIM records in those types of tools. Right, and then next week, as a reminder, next week on May 26th, it's going to be ongoing management. That's what we'll talk about the reports. So we'll go into more detail about what the aggregate reports are, what they look like, what the forensic reports are, and what they look like, and what are some actions that you need to take in terms of reviewing. Once you review those reports, what are some of the actions that you may have to take? So we're at the end time, but we did start 2 minutes late. So I do see, I believe, 2 questions there. So I will answer those 2 questions and any other questions that pop up. If you can't stay, thank you for joining us. Again, email us or post on the community forum any questions or comments that you may have, and we'll answer your questions there as well. If you can't stay, thank you for joining, and we'll see you next week. So let's see here. How do we deal with a subdomain that generates email, but the super domain does not? We would like to block any other subdomain. So just like I showed you with the last part of the demo, of the demonstration, right? So at the top level domain, put in SPF-all, right? Put that empty SPF record and put in the DMARC value of reject. So P equals reject, but then add in SP equals none, right? So that way that reject value only applies to the top level. The SP tag equal to none is going to say that the sub-level domains don't apply this policy to the sub-level domains in essence. And then at each sub-level domain, you're going to go ahead and create the DMARC policies, set up your DKIM, and set up your SPF there as well. How big are the email reports for RUA and RUF? That's a good question. They're not that large. I think, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. If I can't answer it, I'll definitely have the answer next week. But I mean, I've seen them in kilobytes. You know, they're very small. I mean, I don't think I've seen anything larger than a meg, maybe 2. I mean, I don't think I've seen anything larger than that. So I think I've only seen like maybe a meg or less. I don't think I have, let me see if I have any. I don't think I have any on my system that I can show or give an answer to for sure, but let me check really quick just in case. But I've only seen them tend to be like anywhere, you know, just a few kilobytes, nothing very large. Yeah, I don't have any to give you an exact answer, but they're usually small and they're usually in the kilobytes. But I don't think I've seen anything larger than a meg, but I could be wrong. All right, so those are the 2 questions that I see. Again, if there's any questions, I'll stay on for another minute. If I don't see any questions, then we'll go ahead and end this session. But again, as a reminder, you do not need to attend the session tomorrow. I mean, you're more than welcome to attend if you choose to. Just acknowledge the fact that the first half is going to be the same, it's going to be repetitive. The second half is we're just going to show you on a cloud service providers how to implement SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. Otherwise, next week's session is going to go into the reports and go more details about the reports. And I'll make sure to have the answer that the exact size of the reports next week. So questions, should we do DKIM signing from Office 365 or an iron port or both? I recommend doing it from both. And the reason I recommend that is just as a safeguard, right? So iron port should be the primary one where everything goes through. But I have seen some rare instances where Office 365 will send some message, like sometimes it's a calendar or something that it sends through its own systems and doesn't go through the iron ports. So I recommend using both. It's fine if it has both records, as long as the policies, as long as the public key records are in place, the CNAME records and the text records are in place, everything should be fine and it shouldn't create any or cause any conflicts. And then you can also, from the reports, you can confirm it and confirm it from the reports. And that's what I've seen over time when people have those combination of Office 365 and iron ports. Majority of the stuff you see from the iron ports, but I've seen some of these messages somehow go through Office 365 and goes through their server. So that's why I always say, just in case if those messages there, we can't figure out what those messages are specifically, just to be safe, let's just put in DKIM there as well. All right, so those are all the questions that I see. Again, thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you next week.